This project is made possible by support from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Missouri Arts Council, and the Kansas City Art Institute.
Welcome to the Mother Ann podcast, where women who are both artists and mothers discuss their diverse experiences as creators and caregivers. I'm Eleanor Lynn Midyett, project manager and co-curator of the Mother Ann Project and assistant professor of liberal arts at the Kansas City Art Institute. I'm also the mother of 4 sons. Each episode features discussions with artists and other individuals involved in the Mother Ann exhibition, which runs from September 5th to November 21st, 2025 at the Leedy-Voulkos Art Center in Kansas City, Missouri. The exhibit and the podcast disrupt preconceived notions that parenthood diminishes one's artistic practice and celebrate motherhood as a source of expansive creative potential.
There are many ways as a woman in this society, I am not able to be all the things all the time. And that idea or that expectation that I'm supposed to sets me up to feel as if I have failed. But the act of making the imagery becomes a method that I can connect with audiences and say, we are doing this all together.
In this episode, I speak with artist mother Diana Heis.
My name is Diana Heis. I am a research-based, socially engaged artist who uses performance, lens-based practices, and writing in order to consider ideas of attunement and regeneration for both social and cultural contexts. Most recently, I have been making work that really cites myself as an ecofeminist. So this relates both to photographic images that are produced as performances for camera, and then also a more material, paper-based work that's using light-sensitive materials to be able to attune to environmental contexts. So those are the 2 things that I'm working on at this stage. I started as a dancer. So I was moving through choreography, and I had a person ask me at one point, well, if you could do anything. I first thought I wanted to be a physicist, so I went to college thinking I was going to be a physicist. And this person asked me, if you could do anything, what would you do? And I was like, oh, I'd be a choreographer. He's like, oh, that's an interesting answer. I was like, okay. So I found this moment where I wanted to be able to move the audience, and then I found 16 millimeter film production so that I was able to sort of consider the relationship to the lens almost like a pas de deux. And once I found lenses, I was able to then connect that with my interest in science. And that really launched this idea of how to combine my intellectual engagement with my aesthetic engagement.
Can you talk a little bit about your children and the stage of parenting that you're at?
So at this stage, I have 2 biological children and 1 stepdaughter. So I have a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old, and my stepdaughter is 20. So I've had multiple roles within parenting in terms of learning how I wanted to be a mother or what are the methods of mothering in our culture. So at this stage, particularly with the little girls, since we've launched the bigger girl, I'm thinking a lot in terms of what does it mean to raise siblings. I'm an only child, so I think a lot about what is conflict, what are dynamics, when do I intervene, when do I not intervene, how do I want us to function as a family. So, we are having sort of regular family meetings to consider what are things that we want to do as a group. And I feel like I'm at the stage where I'm trying to really learn who they are as people, because at this age of 5 and 8, they're really becoming themselves, and what are the contexts I need to put them in so that they can develop into their best selves, so to speak.
Can you describe your practice before having children and after having children, and how did having children impact or create sort of this change or shift in your practice?
So I wasn't always sure that I wanted to have children. So I went to graduate school about a year after my undergrad. So I didn't have that much time between. And I remember being sort of in the younger part of the cohort. Most people were about 30 and I was about 23. And people would come to me and say things like, "Oh, you're going to make such a great mother." But it stung in a way where I felt like they were trying to put me in a particular position of how to be a woman in society. So I paid attention to that feeling and being like, well, I don't know if I want to do that. So I also knew that there was a lot that I wanted to get done. But there was a moment when I was about 31 and I had broken up with someone and was driving in my little Honda Civic back to the East Coast and was in a pine forest somewhere in Kentucky, and this voice just was in my head, was like, "I want to be in the world." I'm like, "Who are you?" So it wasn't until then that I knew that there was some biological instinct that I wanted to have a baby. So I held on to that feeling. But I also knew that there was, a lot I wanted to do. So when I was 33, I went to live in Mauritius. I had a Fulbright fellowship to live there, and I was able to embed myself into these cultural heritage movements or cultural heritage organizations that were working to preserve a musical form called Sega Typique. So I'm also a classically trained singer, so the way that I was able to embed myself into these communities was to sing. So I just kept showing up to rehearsals, and then the projects came from there, which actually took about a decade of my life. But the level of embeddedness or engagement, I couldn't have had kids at that stage. So when I came back from that experience, I could tell that there was a shift that was starting to happen that was like, no, I want to have children. And I came back, and I remember that it was really clear to me that my now husband and I were going to get married, and there was a job for me to apply to. So I remember walking into the building being like, Davin and I are going to get married. We're going to have babies. So I'm going to get this job. And so I did. And then I got married, got tenure, and had my first child.
So how has being a mother inspired your art practice? And also, have there been moments when motherhood served as a challenge to your art practice, or more specifically, how the world's expectations for motherhood posed a challenge to your practice?
I would say that particularly because of the one series that I will probably be working on for 20 years called De-Assimilation Diet, that was specifically started because of my need to feed my child, to feed Adira. So the two young girls is Adira and Daphne. Adira is 8 years old, Daphne is 5 years old. So when Adira was about 6-7 months old, she dropped in her birth weight percentile, and she was only breastfed at that stage. So they had me introduce solid food. And my grandmothers have all passed. So from my mother's side of the family, it's all Eastern European farming family. So I didn't have my Hungarian grandmother to ask, like, what did you make? Because in my world, I can't eat processed food. I have lots of medical stomach things. So I was not going to go out and buy a bunch of, bottled baby food. So and I found that this is what happens in my practice, is that there is some sort of intellectual question, and then I go to this intense research process that then relates in an aesthetic experience. So for this, it started with doing research into different forms of food and then making these images that relate to those types of materials to try and talk to the experience of motherhood as this raw, primal, but also spiritual experience. This work also came because I went to the Kemper, and I've apologize that I can't remember the artist's name, but I saw this image of a woman, and it was a portrait around motherhood, where there's a woman in a very sort of Victorian setting. She's looking over her shoulder while holding her baby with this forlorn look. And I had this really intense reaction to this image, that it was not the actual experience of motherhood or the transmission of that, but was reliant on the acting of the performative aspect of how that person was organizing her face. And for some reason, that just like drove a like spike in my heart that I'm like, this is not acting. This is very, very real and intense and visceral. So my challenge to myself was, how do I make an image that can move between portraiture and still life in order to like generate that sensation of what it feels like to raise a child?
We've been talking a lot with the artist mothers about this ethics of motherhood, which combines their relationship between parenting or mothering, their approach to the world and interacting with the world, and then how that informs their studio practice. So really this process then seems like this intellectual question, and it seems like in this case with the Assimilation Diet, this question about how to feed your daughter Adira. Can you talk about how you solved that problem in the world and then how that was also reflected in the body of work?
So some of the materials that get used, for example, like one of her first weaning foods was egg yolks. So like there's a prominent egg yolk in one of the images. I will say the imagery that resulted from this was also around my pregnancy with Daphne. So there were ways in which the ideas were generated around Adira, but the imagery came from like the moment that I knew that I was pregnant with Daphne. So we found out that I was pregnant when we were at a residency in Wassaic. So that's when I started making all of these material experiences. So the research into the types of foods then resulted into the types of materials that would be in the imagery. In terms of the ideas of ethics, though, I would also add that I think part of what my experience has been in mothering in our society is I do generally feel like I'm set up to fail. So there are also images there where, for example, with Daphne, I had a very intense postpartum anxiety. So there's imagery that resulted from that experience that is channeling those feelings as well. As I've continued the project and continued the thoughts, part of it is helping me to acknowledge, yes, there are many ways as a woman in this society, I am not able to be all the things all the time. And that idea or that expectation that I'm supposed to sets me up to feel as if I have failed. But the act of making the imagery becomes a method that I can connect with audiences and say, we are doing this all together. Here is a way to be able to like experience all of these sensations and not feel alone.
Are there times in your professional career as an artist mother where your role as a mother was challenged or you felt sort of discriminated against? Maybe certain opportunities were withheld because of being a mother?
I will say at this stage, when I look for different opportunities, I see that families aren't always accepted. So, for example, my husband and I have been really active in residency programs. So a lot of the times we will go together to residency programs, but there are not that many family-friendly residency programs. So there have been times where we've asked and they've been okay with that, or they've been people we know, or there have been times where we only apply for the family ones. Last year, I went to the first one by myself. So I'll say, for example, Adira went to her first residency when she was 8 months old. So, I brought the pack and play to the museum. We had a room where she would nap. I would do things, in the morning, by myself, and then there'd be things that we would do together. So, we make it work. But there's definitely ways in which not all opportunities are open. And also timing is part of that. So if something's a 3-month or 6-month residency, I'm not going to be able to pull my children out of school for those types of situations. The other thing I think about in this is also the relationship to role models, because I will say I did not have any artist mother faculty in my training. Even in employment, there are not that many female academics. I knew in the timeline that I was working on that it was why that pressure to get that job at that stage was because if I wanted the security of a job at the time when I was going to be pregnant, that was the only shot, you know? So I was very clear from there. So I think the other question of potential quote unquote discrimination just goes around the fertility cliff. So at what stage can you actually become a mother? And are you at a stage in your career when you are able to make that happen, particularly in a biological way?
When you talk about sort of this cliff of fertility, that there were certain things that you wanted to accomplish before becoming a mother. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, becoming a mother at a later stage in your career?
So once I had the moment in the pine forest that I knew I wanted to have a child, there was a calculation that was being made because I knew that if I wanted to be a successful academic, there was going to need to be a certain amount of work that needed to get done in order for things to happen. Also in myself, and maybe this is even more important, is that I knew there were things I needed to make in the world, and I didn't want to resent my children. I didn't want to have the feeling of, oh, you're here and now I can't do the things I quote unquote want to do. Of course, there's always sacrifices of time and energy and capability and all these things, but I knew that there was a particular amount of things I needed to do of my own practice, of my own psychological state, to be able to be ready to mother the way I wanted to. So I didn't question that that was going to be later. I will also say when I was growing up, my parents are 11 years apart. So my dad was 36 when he got married and 37 when he had me. I was like, that sounds like a great timeline. So
they were your role models then for sort of later
timing.
parenting.
Yeah, now my mom, of course, my mom is younger. So like the fertility cliff wasn't a concern. And I wasn't really thinking about that when I made that calculation in my mind. But then once I knew that I wanted to have children, then I go into the research mode. So I will also add, when I was 5 months pregnant with Adira, I was sitting on my bed. It was a beautiful sunny day. I'm looking out the window. It's clear blue sky. And this other thought pops in my head. I want to be in the world. I'm like, who are you? I haven't gotten this one out. So every single day until I conceived Daphne, so first had to birth Adira and then to conceive her, which is about 2.5 years, that voice was in my head. So I also knew that there was a certain amount of research to do to be like, okay, if I want to have a second child, how much time is going to be between those two? And what is healthy? And what does it mean if I conceive at 39 and birth at 40, or if it's going to be later than that? How do I maximize like my health to be able to, carry that pregnancy?
You said you also have an adopted daughter too. What did you learn from that experience?
Or stepdaughter.
Yes,
yeah.
Stepdaughter.
So it's a very different relationship. And so I learned the differences of what it means to help cultivate someone within your family structure, and what it is to raise biological children. So I have a different perspective of what I think is best for her that is different than my biological girls because I'm the one in charge. So I think it's really important when step parenting that the biological parents are the key decision makers in many ways. I also was very clear that I was not a disciplinarian in that situation. It's more like I'm the cool lady that lives in the house, and that we can have a relationship and a rapport, and I am present. And I helped her with her entire college application process, all of those types of things. But that's a different type of relationship than when I am the biological parent who is helping to shape their neural pathways and be the steady leader. That sturdy presence that mothering is, in a way. I remember the phrase that came into my head when I came back from the residency last year, because that was the longest I'd ever been away by myself, was that family is physical. So what is it mean to be physically present, but also just aware of what that physical engagement is, which means, of course, like food, shelter, all of that, but that there's an energetic presence that is very different about the physical relationship that one has with one's biological children than other humans that I nurture in the world.
Are there insights that you gained from being a mother that transfer over to being a teacher?
So I think that the key thing that I've learned is about listening, is that people in the end want to be listened to and heard. So there's a way in which teaching has taught me that just being present and listening and fully engaged, which is what I like to maintain in my classrooms, where the phones are supposed to go away. It's the sacred space that we get to be together with the work, that I want to make sure that I maintain that when I'm mothering, when I'm with my kids, so that all the other things go away and I can be fully present with them. So I think the relationship of what presence does is something that I see as transferable between those two. I think the other thing that becomes important too in terms of teaching in relationship to mothering, which isn't necessarily a skill per se, but is more a conversation. I will say again, in my training, no one talked to me about things other than like how my writing was going or how was I splicing my film together, those types of conversations. So I also like to open up the conversation to my students about what their notions of success are. And if being a mother is part of their notions of success, then there's a different pathway or multiple pathways, but things that need to be considered that I think should happen in school. So I'm very clear with my students when we do our first day questionnaires now. Essentially, I ask everybody, are there areas that you're going to need grace? Because what I've learned is that some people are caring for elderly family members, or they have a particular reason that they might need to leave the classroom in some capacity, or, there are things that are going on that if we're all upfront in a way, it makes the experience smoother. So I always say, please know I am a mother. And there will be a moment at 2:50, I will be running to my car to get my children from school because they get out at 3. So please don't stop me then to tell me that you want to leave school or you're late on an assignment. I'm present when we are in class together, and I'm fully present for that. But once I leave, I'm transitioning to the other parts of my life, my other roles and duties in my life. And I think that's important to have those types of boundaries, number one, because then they understand, like, I'm not ignoring them or not paying attention, but also because then they understand what it's going to mean if they want to mother, that they can also put boundaries in place that says, these are the other things that are important in my life.
What does it feel like to you when you enter into that professional space as an artist mother? And how does that feel as opposed to maybe, being in a mothering space or, in your home life?
One of the things that I think about in terms of moving into these particular different types of spaces is first considering, are people going to acknowledge or understand that I might approach something differently as a mother? So is someone going to understand if I get a phone call that I might need to go? Or is that going to be seen as being unprofessional? If I show up late to a meeting because the meeting, starts when the girls are getting out of school, and I need to then run the gauntlet of getting this kid to this place before I can even start, because there isn't necessarily a consideration that says, oh, we start everything at 3 p.m., so that means everybody can be there at 3 p.m. Like everything in the world is happening at 3 p.m.
Right.
So
breaking that patriarchal paradigm of the schedule, that really rigid schedule that doesn't take into account that people are human and that they have obligations to other people.
And that if you don't maintain that schedule, that you are then a disrespectful, unprofessional person. So I think about that. And I also, I value those things. So part of it is the balance in one's own mind of wanting to be someone who can do all the things. Like, I know I have my own tendencies towards perfectionism, so I have to check myself in certain ways that says, okay, what are you trying to achieve here? It goes back to this question of being set up to fail. So if one's trying to maintain all of these standards, but they're at the deficit of oneself, what's the point? And in the end, my kids are the most important part.
Does that carry over into your parenting in terms of, teaching the girls how to interact in life? And maybe how does nurturing creativity also inform that?
So I think there's two aspects to it. I think part of it is considering creativity, which is I really learned in my work in Mauritius, is that creativity isn't this luxury object. It's an innate human need. So when we relate it back to notions of being human, of surviving, but not necessarily struggle type survival, but the type of survival of like what makes you feel whole. I think first when we consider creativity in that lens, then we can see it as something that we all need in our lives and therefore need to cultivate. So that's sort of step one. Step two is that I think what's innate in creativity, at least again in my definitions that have really come from my teaching, is that it's about experimentation. You have to see what the outcome is. So I will say Adira in particular, they're both in this way. Adira is just a bit older, so I've seen it more, is incredibly process driven. So I can give her some watercolor paints and some paper towels, and she'll go through this like intense dyeing process. Well, she'll transfer color from one to the other, re-wet, and there isn't necessarily a result that she's really interested in, but she's interested in the experience. Same thing happens when we go to the clay guild. She's not making anything on the wheel, but she has all of this tactility happening. So that sense of experimenting to see what happens is what I think is key, which leads to the ability to expand so that it opens up all of the potentials and possibilities of what one is capable of doing. So it isn't just a prescribed, oh, I'm really good at this test. I must be good at this. This is what I do.
So not really end-driven, but more being in the moment, experimenting, process-oriented.
Yeah.
And is that part of your teaching too, do you think? Like
Definitely.
That you encourage your students to experiment and lean into the process and not being afraid to fail?
Yes, that is the core. I was teaching sophomores for 17 years, and the core of the first semester sophomore year was what I would phrase as wild experimentation. The goal was to try all the things, particularly things they had never done before, because they're not going to know it until they do it. And as I'm noticing more and more, because we've had the effects of No Child Left Behind in testing, is that the ability for people to experiment is becoming harder because people are so concerned of whether or not they're going to be smart or whether they're going to be good at something and being praised for that. That neural pathway has become really strong. So instead, I praise for perseverance, not for the result.
How does this philosophy of leaning into the possibility for failure and, perseverance, praising for perseverance, relate to your own practice?
So I've been thinking a lot about this idea of perfectionism versus experimentation in my own practice, particularly after the work that I was doing in Mauritius. When I started making that work, I was really ready to let go of any criteria that was coming from art world gatekeepers of what kind of work I was supposed to be making, to the point that I did not care if it was considered art. So then it means it shifts my criteria of what I'm trying to work towards. So that reframes this notion of what the experiment and the expansion is, because I'm looking for a particular type of output or impact that isn't necessarily related to what is the perfect way to make a video in the context of contemporary art today. So my experience in Mauritius changed everything. It changed how I make. It changed when do I suspend my idea of what a piece is supposed to be in the process. So if I don't know what something's supposed to be in the beginning, it's okay, and I can figure it out potentially in the middle or after I've made it or after it's screened. I also learned that the impact of community and working communally results in a very different type of artwork. For example, this film that we made where we're reconstructing a frame drum in a manner that had been essentially lost and then revived through this filmmaking process, and then having that be elevated to be in these like national theaters, then shifts how we see that particular object. So that when that piece now screens and continues to screen in this small community center on like a 19-inch flat screen for these young children who've now grown up with it, but at that stage, the first round of young children had never seen their own heritage in this context. It's like, that's the most important part.
Can you think of a specific example with a student? Because I think sometimes they've been schooled so much in that achievement, perfection. Also, so many students come here and they have a definite idea of what they're going to major in or a certain kind of medium. How do you encourage them to break out of that box then?
So I think about it first off with an elective that I used to teach called Topics on Expanded Cinema Practice, which used to be a required sophomore class until we did some reorganization. And that class moved really fast. So the idea was I presented an idea on a Tuesday. We did some workshopping on a Thursday. There was a production day where they could be working in class and I could support them, and then they screened the thing. And we did that 7 times. And each thing was being introduced. So it was almost like there wasn't enough time to think. You just had to make. There's a sense of pushing that's happening from the curriculum, which is not putting pressure on the perfectionism and, oh, this has to be okay, because I would frame this as these are all sketches. I do not expect you to have finished things for all of these assignments. You can push it to a certain amount of that you can, but you only have so much time. So get it to a stage where you've really played with the idea and manifested something, and then we're going to move on to something else. So I think that helps. I think the other thing that has worked is how I frame assignments is they're all riddles. There is no right answer. So there's other aspects of the curriculum that we're very clear that there are right answers, like what is pixel aspect ratio, what is frame rate, all of those things that are technical and solid, steady, no wiggle room, where in the assignment itself, they have to practice all of those things, but the conceptual and interaction with the historical aspect, there is no right answer. So I'm very clear to them at the beginning that there is no right answer. The only answer is how you interpret the riddle that I have given you.
How does that relate then to parenting?
So I try not to solve their problems for them. So part of it is, I think this also manifests in their sense of play. One of the things that I've been working on lately is to ask them to ensure that each of them can have their vision in the play. So instead of being told no all the time, that they can enact what they see, which I think also really leads back into thinking about collaboration. So when students are collaborating, a collaboration doesn't work if everyone's vision can't be someone engaged in the work. Yes, it's a negotiation. Yes, there can be conflict, but if one person decides this is how the entire piece is going to be, and it's supposed to be a collaboration, and everybody else just ends up, holding a boom pole and doing whatever that other person wants, then that isn't an active collaboration. So I think about that with my children when they move through conflicts, is how does that improve their communication skills so that they will have a strong relationship? And I know part of that is because, again, from my only childness, is that I mildly had 2 of them, so they would just love each other for the rest of their lives. And when I see them fight, I'm like, what do you mean? I had 2 of you so that you could have one another, which I know is a completely unfair expectation when I talk to sibling people that I know. But I think that, again, these ways to try and consider multiple perspectives or how someone else can feel and building their emotional intelligence, engaging their senses of empathy, and then how they are able to verbalize that, those are the things we're really working on.
Earlier in our discussion, you described yourself as an ecofeminist. Mm-hmm. So can you describe how being an ecofeminist impacts your parenting and also your studio practice for example, your series of work, We Are of This World?
So I really define ecofeminism as a way in which both the female body and ecologies have been cited as resource, and how to break that notion for a larger societal context so that we can consider what is the worth and value of diverse genders, and also the ways in which our ecologies have intelligence, and use that as an ethic for the work. So there are multiple ways that that functions. For We Are of This World in particular, that work came out of a lot of ecologically engaged activist work that I was doing, both from performance and with video. So, for example, I made a performance piece where 3 performers and I were buried in 300 pounds of clover seeds on top of an arson wood sculpture, where during the opening, it's called Take Only What You Can Give. So the idea was that the audience was responsible for unburying us, but they were also responsible to the seeds that they were going to then plant if they were going to take them. So there's a negotiation of where your senses of responsibility are. That work also led to a piece that I made when I was in Mauritius, or I started when I was in Mauritius, where I was working with artisanal fishing communities, but also tying that back to my home, of my origin. So I grew up on an island in the middle of Lake Champlain, and it's a 300-mile-long lake. It's the sixth largest lake in the United States, so it's a beast of a lake. So it's really interesting to look at the historical and colonial histories of both of those locations, but then also to look at both artisanal fishing communities and make these connections, particularly in relationship to climate change. And I started reading Emergent Strategies by Adrienne Maree Brown. I learned, a lot about the notions of biomimicry and attunement, and that probably the most radical thing that I could do was most fully attune to my own environment in order to consider what my hyperlocal is. So I was thinking about that in this way. I'm like, how do I really attune to where I am? And does that help other people connect to where they are? So I started using light-sensitive materials like cyanotype in order to essentially interact or collaborate with my houseplants, which turned into a piece where I'm using them almost like a sundial. So for 8 days and 8 hours every day, I made one exposure underneath my plants. So it maps the weather for those 8 days. I'm now using also different color palettes and using different toners. So they might not necessarily be the same sense of sundial, but it's collapsing multiple exposures with botanicals and recycled materials and making these collages where the goal is that they can go into people's homes and have a very materially made work that reminds them that they are in a material world, in hopes that they will make decisions in their day that support the ecology in which they live.
So do you translate then these ethics to your parenting then? How do you introduce them to the girls so that it's a part of their daily life?
So there's been multiple methods. One is that they all know how to make cyanotypes. So they, if you want someone to start, and also these other color-based, light-sensitive materials that I use. So, Daphne can walk you through the entire process. So they collaborate with me in that sense. They collected all the botanical materials for the last toner that I made, and we do them together. So part of it is just engaging them in the work. The other part is that we do a lot of storytelling and reading. So we just finished Wangari Maathai's biography that was, again, part of this series called Good Night Stories for Rebel Girls. So we'll read about other women who have engaged in social contexts or conundrums. And I think that type of role modeling becomes really good. So I have lots of those types of books. And in terms of, this is more maybe a general idea of things that they have to contend with as young women, is just talking to them about beauty standards. why do people have to look a particular way? Or, I talk about this with all of the girls of like, what are the stigmas that are around stepmothering, and how does particular media engage that? I've started their media literacy education where we read Alice in Wonderland, the book, the original. Then we went to see the ballet. Then we watched the Disney movie, and I still want to watch the very wonderful but creepy Jan Svankmajer, who's a Czech claymation artist. Like, he has a version of Alice, which is incredible. So we'll watch all of these different iterations to really understand that they're all translations, and then what do they actually mean.
So media literacy is really part of your parenting then.
Definitely.
And the difference between appearance versus reality, and knowing what reality is and being able to tell the difference then.
And understanding that stories are constructed, that they are making decisions as to what is included or what is not included, and that they have an ethic to them of how women might be perceived, viewed, considered. There's also a lot of stories with dead mothers. So we talk a lot about the dead mothers, to the point that now Adira will say things like, why do there have to be so many dead mothers in these stories? And so she's aware. She's like looking out for these things,
Right.
which to me is really key.
Why are there so many dead mothers?
So there's multiple ways that I think about that. I don't understand for some reason why Bambi has to have a dead mother, for example. That one's a little harsh for me. In Women Who Run with the Wolves, the folkloric book, there is part of the story, particularly, I think it's called the story of Bluebeard, where part of it is the mother figure is not present because the girl has to essentially figure out how to not be captured. So it's like a survival instinct, and they're only going to do that when a mother's not present. At least that's what is explained. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. Why do I have to not be around? But I continue to think about that question a lot, which I think will particularly come into play as they get older. And what's my role once I'm not in this like deep caregiving stage? Because I am, with the little girls, I am in a very like hands-on deep time. And I know that that's going to change as they get older, but I also don't necessarily want to follow the methodologies that I'm told I'm supposed to do, because that's how you're quote unquote supposed to mother a teenager or a college kid. I mean, I just don't want to follow any rules that I don't want to.
So when I approached you about the project, Mother Ann, and the exhibition, you were 100% on board. So what does it mean to you to be part of the Mother Ann exhibition and project?
I feel very honored to be part of this project because I think that it gives visibility to a way to make work or a way to be in the world that for so long was supposed to be invisible. So people might have been mothers, and I think about that with my own mentors. Some of them might have been mothers, and I just didn't know because they weren't really allowed to say that, or they weren't in a social context where they had that room. So I really believe in the potency of making things visible that were once invisible. I think about this particularly in the sense of how humans understand things. We understand things because we make categories. And if we have decided as a collective group to make a category that says, oh, mothers do this over here, this is how you mother, then when there aren't other visible methods to not do it that way, then we're doing a disservice to our children, to women, to future mothers, to people supporting mothers. So I think seeing a diversity of ways of how to be in the world as female, as mother, as gender diverse is deeply important.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for challenging the traditional patriarchal paradigms and also for giving visibility to your own narrative and for being so welcoming to diverse narratives about how to be a mother.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
This podcast was produced by Cleo Scroll Productions, with Kara Heitz as the director and Emily Milner as the audio engineer. Music is by Brooke Tooley and the Moon Travelers. The Mother and project team includes Eleanor Lim Midyet, project manager and co-curator, Courtney Wasson, co-curator, Laura Berman, senior consultant, Stephanie Leedy, Leedy-Voulkos Art Center owner and mother of the Crossroads, Erin Woodworth, Leedy-Voulkos Gallery Manager, and Debbie Barrett-Jones, Leedy-Voulkos Gallery Assistant. An extra thank you to the Kansas City Artists Coalition, Distribution by Air Company, and Hotel Indigo for their support. Don't forget to listen to the other episodes of the Mother and podcast, and also remember to check out the Mother and exhibition, which runs from September 5th to November 21st, 2025 at the Leedy-Voulkos Art Center in Kansas City, Missouri. More information can be found on their website at www.leedy-voulkos.com. That's www.leedy-voulkos.com. Thanks for listening.